welcome to the MBSE Embassy. Today we'll be talking about context and context modelling in order to increase our understanding of the system. Context modelling is perhaps one of the most underused and underrated yet essential parts of any MBSE or indeed any modelling activity. When we think of something like a system context, we typically think of it defining the need for our system. But what's very important to understand about the context is that there are many contexts that can describe our system. There isn't just one. Let's illustrate this with some examples. The first example we're going to use is that of stakeholders or stakeholder roles. Now, a stakeholder role we define as the role of any person, any organisation or anything that has an interest in our system, and there will be multiple stakeholder roles. In fact, the number of stakeholder roles that exist can be quite bewildering. If we looked to ISO standards, for example, and most of the process-based ISO standards, they introduce three broad categories of stakeholder role, which are customer, external, and supplier. The supplier stakeholder roles we can think of as us, if you like. It's typically things like engineers and managers. It's typically the roles associated with delivering the system, whatever it may be. Over to the left-hand side now, we see the customer and the external roles. The customer roles, for example, will be the end users of the system, the operators of the system, and the sponsor of the system. The external, which we can see in the centre of the diagram, these are things that we don't really have much control over, such as laws, standards, and so on. The main difference between the supplier and the other two categories is that the supplier is the us, if you like, and the customer and externals is the them, if you like. There's a subtle yet important difference between the customer and external roles, and that's that the customer roles we can generally compromise with. If there's some need that we can't achieve, for example, we can generally go and talk to these customer roles and reach some sort of compromise. It's usually far more difficult, time-consuming, and expensive, if it's even possible at all, to compromise with things like laws and things like standards. So that's the difference between the three broad categories that we have there. Now, when we're developing any system, when we're involved in any systems engineering endeavour, one of the key things that we want to do is to be able to manage the expectations of the stakeholders. In fact, all these different stakeholders that we see here. The problem that we have, however, is that all of these stakeholders will view things in different ways. They will view the system in different ways. They will view the needs for the system in different ways. And it's very important that in order to have a good, clear understanding of our system, that we can understand the needs of these different stakeholders and therefore the expectations of these different stakeholders. Because if we don't understand the need from these different points of view, how on earth are we going to demonstrate to them that we've satisfied their original needs? So staying with this diagram now, let's imagine what some of the different names associated with the different stakeholders would be for a particular system. So let's imagine we're talking about a passenger airline system. And let's consider who are the end users of a passenger airline system. Now, this isn't a trick question. The end users for a passenger airline system would be the passengers. It might be me, for example, going on holiday or going on a business trip. Who are the operators? Well, the operators are going to be all the people in all the different parts of the organisation that make the system run properly, ranging from pilots to safety stewards to people selling you the tickets and so on and so on. In terms of the sponsor, that will be the people, the shareholders, for example, who actually own the airline and are making profits from that airline. Moving across now, you can imagine that in the world of civil aviation, there are many, many laws and many, many standards that need to be complied with. On the supplier side, we'll typically have our engineers that are developing the products, and we'll typically have the managers who are supervising and making sure that we can deliver that project on time, within budget, and within resource. Now, a key point that we want to make here is that these different stakeholder roles can look at the same piece of information, yet interpret it in very different ways. So let's consider a basic need that we might have associated with a passenger airline. Let's keep this at a very high level, and let's just say that we had a need to save money. If we got all of these stakeholder roles round the table and asked them, do you understand what save money means? everybody would nod their heads, everybody would smile and say, of course we understand what to save money means. And then they'd all walk off in different directions and go and implement this need to save money in whatever way they see fit. This, however, is where the problem starts, because if I was taking the role of an end user, let's imagine I was going on holiday, and you ask me, well, what do you mean by saving money? What's your interpretation to save money? I'll say, well, there's a few things associated with that. I want to get lots of free stuff. So, for example, I want free food, I want to have free drinks, I want to watch movies for free as well. But also, I want lots and lots of legroom. Ideally, I don't want anybody else anywhere near me on that flight, because I don't really like people, if I'm being honest. I want to have very good service, and I want to be able to smoke. They might be my genuine interpretation of that need to save money. Now, that may all seem perfectly reasonable or unreasonable, depending on your point of view, but let's now consider that same need to save money from a completely different point of view. Now let's consider it from the point of view of the operator. In terms of the operator, some of the things that to save money might mean would be, let's provide online checking for people. That way, it's going to save time and effort at the airport, it's going to be more efficient, and we might not have to employ as many people. In the same vein, let's provide online ticket printing services. That way, we don't have the cost of the printing equipment, we don't have the cost of the consumable resources, and again, we're saving time and being efficient. And obviously, at the same time as that, we want to actually optimize the service that we're providing for the end users of our system. Now let's consider that same need to save money from another context. In this case, it's the sponsor context. Actually, if you think about what the sponsor means by save money, does the sponsor want me to have free food and free drink and watch free movies? No, the sponsor wants to charge for these different goods. Also, the sponsor really doesn't want me to have that much legroom and that much space. In fact, the sponsor wants to optimize the space in some way. And also, the sponsor's got other, if you like, hidden requirements or constraints that we can see here. Things that are going to limit the way that the sponsor can achieve these things in some way. So, for example, the sponsor is going to need to be concerned with complying with standards. Now, one of the main points that we're trying to make here is that we can take the same need to save money, and actually, depending on the point of view that we're looking at this from, depending on our personal interpretation of this, based on whatever stakeholder role we're playing, it can take on a very, very different meaning. If we compare the user to the operator, it takes on a completely different meaning. My context in terms of the user, the passenger, if you like, is to get free stuff and not spend much money. From the operator's point of view, clearly it's more the operational side of things, the process side of things. Things become more interesting when we compare the user context, so the passenger, and the sponsor context, so the shareholders. What's interesting here is that these interpretations of that same need to save money are actually in conflict. They're completely different. I want to get things for free. The sponsor actually wants to charge me for goods. What we've just identified there is a conflict on the interpretation of that basic need to save money. This can be a problem. This means we're going to have to compromise in some way. And as we said earlier, compromise is a big part of managing stakeholder expectation. But things get even more interesting now, because if you think back to my need, one of my user needs was I wanted to be allowed to smoke. I wanted to be able to smoke on the aeroplane. Does the sponsor want me to smoke? Because you can bet if the sponsor could charge me to smoke, the sponsor would charge me to smoke. However, that's irrelevant whether I want to smoke or whether the sponsor wants me to smoke, because there's a major constraint that comes in here, which is to comply with standards. And the standard says you are not allowed to smoke. In fact, the law states you are not allowed to smoke. And so it completely overrides any other interpretations of any part of to save money, because that's the standard, that's the law, for example. So in this case, we've got a conflicting interpretation of the need. I want to be able to smoke. The law says I can't smoke. And there's a clear winner there when it comes to how do we compromise. We can't compromise one of those particular stakeholders takes absolute authority over the other one. So the basic premise of what we've been talking about here is that different stakeholder roles can look at the same piece of information and interpret these in different ways. This is important because we need to manage the expectations of the stakeholders. It's also important because we need to be able to identify any conflicts that exist and resolve those conflicts based on the stakeholder roles, based on the priorities, and so on. When we take a piece of information, such as a need, and we interpret it from a different point of view or a different context, if you like, we call this a use case. And this is a very important concept when it comes to modelling. One of the big misunderstandings concerning use cases in use case modelling is that a use case is the same as a need. It isn't. A use case is an interpretation of that need from a specific point of view or from a specific context. And that's one of the things that we're trying to get across here, is that these use cases will change depending on the context that we're looking at them from. So it's possible to have a single need, yet many different interpretations of this, many use cases associated with that same need. So that's what we mean when we talk about context and context modelling. It's about looking at things from different points of view, different contexts, and understanding how these different points of view interpret that original need. This is incredibly important because not only does it increase our understanding of the system, but also when it comes to validation, you have to think, well, surely if different stakeholders can interpret the same information in different ways, then surely the way that we demonstrate we can satisfy those underlying needs is also going to be different. But we have to bear in mind that context isn't solely dependent on stakeholder roles. There are different types of contexts. So for example, depending which level in the system hierarchy we're concerned with, that can also change. Let's imagine just a simple system hierarchy where a system is made up of subsystems, each subsystem is made up of assemblies, and each assembly is made up of a number of components. Now let's very quickly perform the same exercise. Let's think of a basic need. Let's imagine we had a need on this aircraft to be efficient. At the system level, being efficient might actually mean we want so many miles per tank of fuel. Okay, so that might be the way that we measure this and the way that we demonstrate we satisfied it. At the next level down, at the subsystem level, we might be looking at the engine, for example. And there, when we talk about being efficient, it might be meeting certain criteria to do with the power throughput of the engine. Dropping down another level to the assembly, there we might be thinking of a particular component of the engine, maybe the motor, and there being efficient might be all to do with the speed of that motor and the velocity at which it goes round. At the lowest level there, we might be interested in more looking at the materials or the algorithms that are involved at the component level. So again, we take the same basic need to be efficient, and we see that it takes on different interpretations depending on the level of system hierarchy. So here we've got an example of context dependent, not just on stakeholder role, but in this case, the system hierarchy and the level that we're interested in the system hierarchy. So the same need to be efficient will take on a different meaning depending on the level that we sit in the system hierarchy. So, to summarize, in order to understand our system properly, we need to look at things from different points of view. We need to identify what these different points of view are, these different contexts are. They could be based on stakeholder, they could be based on levels of system hierarchy. But we need to identify what those different contexts are. We then need to look at our basic information and look at it from these different contexts, consider it from these different points of view, because some of them will be conflicting. In that situation, we need to deconflict them. We need to somehow resolve those conflicts. Now, there are a couple of arguments against context modelling, one of which is, well, I'm not interested in stakeholders, I'm only interested in the system context. This is a fallacy. If you're interested in the system context, you have to be interested in the different stakeholder points of view as well. If you don't understand the expectations of your stakeholders, how on earth are you going to deliver a good system? Another argument that people often put against context modelling is to say, Well, that's an awful lot of work, isn't it? Well, it is a lot of work, yes, but we're dealing with a complex world. We're dealing with complex systems, and at the end of the day, we're engineers. Look at all the history of systems engineering, look at all the graphs. The sooner we can sort out any of these misunderstandings, the quicker and the earlier in the life cycle that we can resolve any of these conflicts, and the more money we will save later on. So there we have it then. In order to understand your system, look at it from different points of view, identify context, and compare the interpretation, if you like, the use cases associated with each of the contexts. Deconflict any conflicts that arise, understand these different points of views, and manage the different stakeholders' expectations.